Hi, it's Mrs. Clark. Welcome to Lesson 4 in Unit 2, Fraction and Decimal Number Sense. Today we are going to take a look at comparing and ordering fractions and decimals in both ascending or descending order, or increasing and decreasing order. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure that you're ready. Do you have your math notebook and your math notes that you need for this video? Make sure that you're focused and I have your full attention. And if you're ready, let's get started. By the end of today's video, you will be able to compare a set of fractions, mixed numbers, and decimals. Let's start with comparing some fractions. When you compare fractions, you can do it several ways. Let's start with looking at fractions that have like denominators or the same denominators with different numerators. And in order to see which fraction is bigger, we'll just need to look at which numerator is larger. So let's look at 3/4 and 2/4. You'll notice that the 4 on the bottom is the denominator and they're both the same. So I can compare numerators and see that 3 is larger than 2. I can also draw a picture to help me see which fraction is larger. So my red circle on the left and my blue circle on the right, you can see that more of the red is colored than the blue. So that confirms that 3/4 is larger than 2/4. And I could indicate that with the greater than symbol. 3/4 is greater than 2/4. Now let's look at some fractions that have like numerators or the same number on top with different denominators on the bottom. In order to do this, you have to remember that when looking at fractions, a bigger number on the bottom doesn't mean a bigger piece. It's tricky because when you see the number 5, 5 is a big number when compared to 2, but 5 is not actually a bigger piece. It's a smaller piece. Think of it this way. If I'm sharing a pizza with 5 friends, how big is your slice? Now, if I'm sharing that same pizza with only 2 friends, now how big is your slice? So the smaller the denominator is actually a bigger piece of the fraction. So let's take a look at 1/4 and 1/2, remembering what the denominators mean. I can draw a picture to help me represent this as well. Now you can clearly see if this was a square pizza, I think I'd rather eat from the 1/2 side because I get a much bigger piece of pizza than if I were to eat on the 1/4 side because I'm sharing it with more people. So in this example, I can say that 1/2 is actually greater. And so I would read this sentence, 1/4 is less than 1/2 because 1/2 is a larger fraction. Now let's take a look at comparing some fractions without necessarily paying super close attention to numerators and denominators, but looking at half and whole, meaning how close to the half mark is my fraction or how close to being whole is my fraction. Let's start with 3/4 and 3/8, and I can show this with a picture and draw a line in the halfway mark of both fractions. Now it's easy to see that 3/4 surpasses or is more than half of my fraction, whereas 3/8 doesn't even make it to the halfway mark. So I can say that 3/4 is larger than or greater than 3/8. What about this example of 5/8 and 7/8? Draw some pictures and you can obviously see that 7/8 is almost the entire fraction colored in. I almost have one whole, and 5/8 is not as colored in as the 7/8 is. So I can clearly and confidently say that 7/8 is greater than 5/8, or 5/8 is less than 7/8. What about using decimals to help us with fractions? Because we learned about decimals in some previous lessons. If you're comfortable changing and knowing the equivalent fractions and decimals, that can also help you compare numbers. So let's start with 1/10 and 1/4. Now we learned these decimals in a previous lesson. Do you remember what they are? Hopefully you said 1/10 is written as 0.1 and 1/4 is written as 0.25. Now, in order to compare decimals, there's one rule to remember, and that's when you have to line up the decimal points, meaning you have to stack them on top of each other, nice and neat and straight, in order to compare numbers. I start on the left with my zeros and compare. 0 is the same as 0, so I can move one more digit to the right. And now I circled 1 and 2 because those numbers are different. And I know the number 2 is larger than the number 1. So that makes that entire decimal or fraction larger. So 0.25 or 25 hundredths is the same thing as 1/4, which means that 1/10 is less than 1/4. Let's try another one. What about comparing with the decimal 1300ths and 7500ths? Now I need to line up those decimal places and the digits, nice and neat and straight. Decimal point right on top of each other. Start at the zeros. Those don't help me. Move one more digit to the right, and I see 1 and 7. You can see I circled those. Which number is larger? The 7. So that means my entire decimal is larger. So 1300ths is less than 7500ths. All right. What if there's a missing number or an empty space? You can just insert an invisible 0 as a placeholder and compare your decimals that way. So let's try it with 2500ths and 2/10ths. Remember, stack up those decimal points, one on top of the other. 0 and 0 are the same. Move over to the next digit. 2 and 2 are the same. Move over to the next digit. Now I have a 5 and an empty space. If I have an empty space, I just insert an invisible 0 as a placeholder. So which digit is larger, 5 or 0? Hopefully you said 5. So 2500ths is greater than 2/10ths. What about mixed numbers? Can we compare those as well? Yes, you can compare them the same way, but don't forget about your whole number because the whole number could change your whole answer if you forget about it. Let's compare 1 and 1/3 to 1 and 1/10. Now, since the whole numbers in this case are the same, they're both 1, I can kind of ignore them for a moment and focus on my fractions. Which fraction is larger, 1/3 or 1/10? Do you remember the rules and what we noticed before comparing fractions? Hopefully you said that 1/3 is a larger fraction. So that means 1 and 1/3 is greater than 1 and 1/10. What about mixed numbers when we compare them as decimals? So 1 and 1300th and 1300ths. Remember, pay attention to the whole number. One of these decimals has a whole number and the other one doesn't. So if I stack them up, now I don't have two zeros to start with. I have a 1 and a 0, and I know 1 is larger than 0. So I can stop there, and I can say that 1 and 1300ths is greater than 1300ths. Well, that's it for today. Today we looked at comparing fractions, decimals, and mixed numbers, and the rules and the strategies that we need to remember when comparing fractions and decimals and mixed numbers. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you on the next video.